So the study questions for the birthmark are a little more ornate. You'll notice the way that I structured them. I frequently rely on the text and ask you to really pick apart the language. So as we think about the birthmark by Nathaniel Hawthorne, think about, in part, the magic realism within the text, that we're dealing with a 19th century text that, unlike our other 19th century texts, isn't exclusively realistic. We've got a main character who is a bit of a mad scientist, to say the least, and there's nuances of the Gothic, especially through his rather creepy assistant. And of course, the scientific experiment, which, much like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, presents the complications with what can happen when human beings attempt to play God, for lack of a better cliche, as the saying's often used a little too much. Now, Hawthorne's tale is bizarre. The scientist can be read as inept, as question number one exemplifies. How can we read the birthmark on Georgiana's cheek as an allegory? The allegory itself reveals that within the historical time frame, the reader was supposed to question the often destructive nature of science on humanity. Science certainly isn't what it is today, and in many ways it was very antiquated. The experiment that Aylmer creates or invents is a problem, as it's one that really focuses on superficiality and constructed notions of imperfection. We can also understand such imperfection from a larger auspice of feminist criticism that would examine the patriarchal realities of not just the scientist and his subject, but the marriage itself. Many writers of this time were fascinated by this. You've heard me already cross-reference Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, a female writer who wrote several years, a couple of decades before, to say the least, on something very similar. What happens when we try and recreate the human being, or in the case of this story, alter the human being? Why do we feel that Hawthorne might tell this tale? I would suggest, within a socio-historical critique, it would reveal the desire of the author to warn the reader against trusting science the way we trust science today. I think in its contemporary context, when it's taught, as we discussed in our seminars, the story itself draws attention to a dynamic within a marriage that is at best a serious problem. Now, Hawthorne as a writer wasn't particularly sly about how he wanted us to read his tales. He does require us to think a little bit, and he'll often bathe his language in a lot of symbolism, as question 2 reveals. If we look at the following quote, and I quote, "It was the fatal flaw of humanity which nature in one shape or another stamps effectively on all her productions, either to imply that they are temporary and finite, or that their perfection must be wrought by toil and pain." How can we break this down to simpler language? I mean, it's set up for us to understand that humanity is supposed to be understood as flawed. So the role of the scientist, by leaving the organized construction of religion of the time and puritanical religion of New England at the time, would very much so be flawed. Nature, in one shape or another, can have a way of creating, quote, her productions in ways to imply that they are finite and other finished, complete products, or temporary products as well, and that their perfection, to come back to the quote, is something that we can only come about through toil and pain. We can think of Darwinism and survival of the fittest, which would come out later in this century, that athletes or intellectuals or scientists work very hard at what they work at to be perfect. And I think what this tale really shows us is the constructed definitions and notions of perfection are indeed false and reductive, right? And you'll notice when I correct your essays, when you guys write perfect, I'll underline it. Perfect is not a great word. We've got to figure out what perfection really means. And the notion of what might or might not be perfect is subjective, as the story shows us. Georgiana is supposed to be very, very beautiful. And then all of a sudden, Aylmer randomly focuses on a birthmark that she had never really paid much attention to, except understanding it as a charm. And it develops through Aylmer's reconstruction of Georgiana as a way of understanding it as something that was less than perfect and something that altered her perfection. This is a troublesome understanding of looking at someone that this character supposedly is in love with. Question 3, we can't answer in a guided study question response, but we did in our work, because I've asked you to find other excerpts within the text that show us what the birthmark symbolizes. And I ask you to think about the way that it symbolizes not just Georgiana's imperfection to Aylmer, but also her uniqueness. Georgiana becomes unique through this birthmark. She becomes different. She becomes different from other women, but she becomes marked as the story reveals, and the birthmark symbolizes what Aylmer feels he needs to fix. Question 4, why on earth would Aylmer want to rid Georgiana of this birthmark? Early on in the story, Hawthorne implies that Aylmer's first and best love is really science. And in many ways, maybe he sees his wife as a walking experiment. And the story thus warns us not to understand other human beings in this way. I would suggest that would be a healthy way about going about question 4, figuring out what does Aylmer like more, science or his wife? Question 5, Aylmer creates a plant that quickly grows. It blooms into a flower and dies at the hands of Georgiana. We could understand this as symbolism. The plant can symbolize Georgiana, but as well, what happens here actually foreshadows what will happen in the story. It almost functions as a warning and a question I ask you, and you can go back to your version of this story. Do we think Georgiana is aware of this as the plant dies in her hands, that it's almost like some kind of higher power speaking to her and letting her know that she is placing herself at a great risk? In response to both the constructions of the text that rely on the Gothic genre and reading of the text that could allow us to understand this patriarchal male spaces of science versus or combined with the male spaces of marriage, and then look at the construction of the female character in this story, we have Aylmer's kind of creepy assistant, Aminadab, who just kind of laughs throughout the story. I feel his laughter reveals what he understands about Aylmer, and that the experiment itself is risky at best, but that Aylmer could be in some way even using his wife as a human experiment. In other ways, we could see these two, or the scientist and his assistant, as almost crowding Georgiana as woman. And this causes more trouble for the way that we might or might not interpret the story. Therefore, for question 7, the birthmark plays with notions of gender, right? It really asks us to think about who's male and who's female and what these things could mean within the 1840s, or Hawthorne sets the time frame before that for sure. So I ask you to think about Aylmer and Georgiana's roles, or the way that their characters are developed in this story in response to gender and gender norms of the time. Does Georgiana undermine or conform to gender norms? I think she is completely subservient here and conforms. I think her decision to marry someone and stay with someone who really is picking on her, and then agree in the way that she does through the dialogue and the short story itself to the experiment, reflects that Georgiana really is, really exemplifies the problems with gendered spaces during this time. And in such a way, we could see the story is almost ahead of itself. Did Hawthorne intend for his story to do this? I don't know. I think Hawthorne's story actually intended to do what I cited earlier on in the study question, guided study questions, that the problem with science at this period of time and placing a blind trust in science with something that puritanical Americans in the, first decades or the first half of the 19th century were rather fearful of. Question 8, this little diatribe led me there, or leads me there. The birthmark reflects both on the state of religion and the limitation of scientific inquiries. So think about placing ourselves back in a time machine and about the dichotomy of both science and religion and the way that the ways of understanding them were split. We could look at American society now and look at, I think it's the Church of Scientology, the anti-vax movements. There's all kinds of realities where either right-wing or left-wing or religious groups are fearful of what science might do or not do. I think the story manifests this for sure. The dichotomy of science religion manifests through Aylmer and his experiments as he really attempts to challenge the way that science can actually override religion, because it doesn't, right? If we think about the ending of this story. If we think about the last lines of the story and what we discussed in class in response to climax and resolution, so for question number 9, think about the ways in which the narrative voice reveals that Aylmer's mistake is really his undoing. In other words, the way that the verb is used in the following sentence, yet had Aylmer reached a profounder wisdom, he need not thus had flung away the happiness which would have woven his mortal life of the same texture with the celestial. So really think about the way the narrative voice does this to Aylmer, and think about our discussions about how science was perceived almost as dangerous during this period of time. Aylmer reflects in humankind a necessity to double think what we might do, especially if we don't understand it on the same level that we might, and that we should be careful when dealing with other human beings, and in this case, new science experiments. Question 10, I asked you to think about your final thoughts of Hawthorne's story. It's really different from the other 19th century stuff that focuses on marriage. Our other texts look at the problems with marriage and even affairs. This text actually sets up a really positive marriage and then almost blows it up through the ideas we've discussed already. So when we get to question 11 and we think about constructing larger main ideas for this story, think about the history, think about early 19th century life, think about the gendered spaces in the story, think about the almost ongoing battle between science and religion articulated through the experiment and marriage in this story, and think about the climax and resolution, where the climax is the scientific experiment and the resolution is sadly Georgiana's passing. I hope that these guided responses held together what we talked about in class, and thank you for listening.